What if your DNA whispered a contradiction, that your blood carries the deserts of Judea and the snow of Lithuania? At the same time, Ashkenazi Jews, for centuries, were seen as a European people. From the synagogues of Krakow to the cobbled alleys of Prague, they were rooted in the map of Christian kingdoms. Outliers, yes, but Europeans all the same. And yet, in their blood, a different story was hiding, one that doesn't quite fit borders or history books. Scientists began to notice something strange. When they sequenced the Ashkenazi genome, they found echoes from two worlds. Half of it sang in Levantine tones, the signature of ancient Semitic tribes, of deserts and scrolls and salt-soaked prophets. The other half, unmistakably European, Southern, Slavic, Mediterranean, centuries apart, yet tangled together in the double helix. How? It would be easy to dismiss it, call it mixture, migration, the chaos of history. But then came a revelation so improbable, it felt like myth. All modern Ashkenazi Jews, over 10 million souls, descend from a mere 350 ancestors. Not a city, not a nation, 350 humans. A bottleneck so sharp, it should have erased them from memory. But it didn't. Instead, they exploded, not in war, not in conquest, but in resilience, in survival. From massacre to mikveh, from exile to empire, their numbers grew. Yet their genetic signature stayed hauntingly the same. Repeated patterns, repeated names, like echoes bouncing off stone. But here's the twist no one talks about. We know the number, 350, but not the names, not the lives. Their faces are lost, except for what lingers in cheekbones and chromosomes. And among them were women, very specific women, just a handful of them, who gave birth to lineages that now span the planet. So who were these mothers? Where did they come from? And why do their genes speak a language older than the books that erased them? They called themselves children of Israel, sons of Abraham, exiles from Jerusalem. But when scientists looked deeper into the unbroken thread of mitochondrial DNA, they found something no one expected. The mothers were European, not from Judea, not from Sinai, but from the forests of the Rhine, the river valleys of Gaul, the shadowed highlands of prehistoric Europe, Paleolithic, pagan, unknown. Their genes, their lineages, make up over 80% of Ashkenazi maternal ancestry. Not a footnote, not an exception, the majority. And yet, history never named them. No chronicles mention the women who stood at the threshold, between worlds, between faiths, and chose to become something new. No scripture tells us what they gave up, what they endured. Only the silence remains. Silent, but undeniable, buried in the cells of their daughters' daughters' daughters. These weren't women brought from Jerusalem. They were likely locals, outsiders, perhaps mocked, perhaps feared, perhaps even revered, as they stepped into a new identity not by birth, but by belief. Did they whisper ancient prayers in accents unfamiliar? Did they light candles with hands that once made offerings to older gods? We don't know. But their legacy lives on, not in tombstones. In mitochondria, in the genomes of millions today, is the echo of 4 women, 4 founders, unnamed, unknown, but biologically mothers to nearly half the Ashkenazi world. This isn't just biology. It's a revelation, a rupture in the myth of lineage. These women weren't carried by history. They carried it, quietly, without inscription. So the question isn't just who they were. It's why no one remembered. And if the mothers came from the heart of Europe, from lands that never knew the Torah, then who exactly were the men? They left no portraits, no swords, no written vows. But in their sons, they left a signature. Y-chromosome traces, hidden deep in the male line, whisper of a journey across continents. Not Roman, not Frankish, but Levantine, Middle Eastern, unmistakably Semitic. Up to 80% of Ashkenazi men carry this code, one that stretches back through desert caravans, temple courtyards, tribal oaths. Not just wanderers, Levites, priestly castes, men who once sang the Psalms of Solomon and carried incense into the first temple. Their genes still echo in the silence between DNA strands. And here's the mystery. That same priestly signature? You'll find it not just in Jews, but in Kurds, in Bedouins, in forgotten villages hugging the Fertile Crescent. Different languages, different rituals, same ancient father. But what happened to these men? They vanished from Judea, not by death, but by diaspora. Pushed out by empire, scattered by conquest, hunted through centuries. Some found refuge in Rome, others in Rhineland forests. They arrived with scrolls and memory, but no army, no homeland, only identity and grief. Still, they didn't vanish. They multiplied. Each boy born carried that same thread, Levantine, defiant, unbroken. They didn't just survive exile, they repurposed it. Priests with no temple became fathers with no soil. And still, they built nations inside ghettos, inside prayers, inside sons. But there's one part missing. For every father who carried the sacred blood, there had to be a mother. And the women, as we now know, were not from the desert. So how did these ancient Levantine men, fugitives of empires, meet and marry women from pagan Europe? What brought them together across distance, faith, and time? By the time Rome ruled the Mediterranean, something unexpected was happening, and no one talks about it. Judaism was spreading, not by sword, not by empire, but quietly, house to house, woman to woman, across the marble courtyards of southern Europe. In some cities, 1 in 10 souls identified as Jewish, not born, converted, chosen. In the shadow of pagan temples, Jewish rituals flickered behind drawn curtains, Sabbath candles lit in villas, Hebrew psalms whispered in Latin accents, Mosaic floors decorated not with gods, but menorahs, and at the heart of it all women, southern women, Greek, Roman, Sicilian. They didn't arrive from Jerusalem. They were daughters of empire. And yet, something pulled them into a different story. Maybe it was love, maybe exile, maybe a longing for order in a world of chaos. Whatever it was, it changed everything. Because those women didn't just join a faith. They built one. Mitochondrial DNA proves it. These weren't occasional converts. They were the mothers of the future. Their genes make up over 80% of Ashkenazi maternal lines today. Which means, the Ashkenazi world didn't just inherit Jewishness, it inherited Roman womanhood, reborn through Torah. But this chapter never made it into the scrolls. Their names? Lost. Their prayers? Unwritten. Their identities? Assimilated. Maybe by choice. Maybe by silence. And when the temples fell, when emperors turned against them, these women vanished into ghettos and legends, remembered only by the DNA in their daughters' bones. Their story is quiet, almost too quiet. And that silence, it hides attention. Because if Ashkenazi Jews are descended from Roman converts, if Jewishness was not just preserved, but constructed, then what does that say about chosen? What does it say about blood? But this peaceful beginning, these hidden mothers, these Roman hearths, it doesn't last. Because there's a second theory, a darker one still whispered today, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in hate speech. And it claims the Ashkenazi people were never from the Middle East at all. It begins like a spy novel, with a vanished empire, a royal conversion, and a question that won't go away. What if the Jews of Europe were never from the Middle East at all? This is the heart of the Khazar hypothesis, a theory that claims Ashkenazi Jews descend not from ancient Israelites, but from a Turkic kingdom that once ruled the steppes between the Black and Caspian seas. The story goes like this. The Khazars, nomads turned kings, adopted Judaism in the 8th or 9th century, then flooded into Europe after their empire collapsed. It sounds cinematic, exotic, even plausible, until you follow the science. When geneticists dug into the Ashkenazi genome, they expected complexity, but not this clarity. No trace of Khazar DNA, no signal from the Caucasus, no genetic markers from Turkic populations, not in the Y-chromosome, not in the maternal line. Nothing. The supposed descendants of a mighty empire don't match the empire at all. And yet, the Khazar theory refuses to die. Because it was never just about history. In the 1970s, it was repackaged by authors who weren't chasing truth. They were chasing political fuel. If Ashkenazi Jews weren't from the Levant, then maybe, they argued, they had no right to return to it. The Khazar myth became a weapon, a way to paint Jews as imposters, foreigners, colonizers. Today, It's whispered in dark corners of the internet, wrapped in footnotes and false citations, pushed by those who care less about origins and more about erasure. But science won't play along. The data is brutal, precise. It draws lines between populations, and none of them point north of the Caucasus. So the Khazar ghost fades. Not with fire, with fact. But as the myth crumbles, a real mystery remains. Because Eastern European DNA is there, in Ashkenazi blood. It's strong, it's recent, and it's not from Khazars. So if not from the steppe, then where did it come from? Erfurt, Germany. The year is 1349. The Black Death is raging. A Jewish community, accused, cornered, and massacred, disappears beneath the earth. For centuries, their bones lie undisturbed beneath the footprint of a granary. Until now. When scientists opened those graves, they expected sorrow, not science. But what they found cracked open a genetic secret frozen in time. 38 individuals, buried in haste, some still holding traces of trauma. But the shock came later, in the lab. There weren't just one people buried there, but two. Skulls laid just meters apart, yet their DNA told opposing stories. One group carried markers tied to Sephardic Jews, Levantine, Middle Eastern, the sons of Jerusalem. The other, laced with unmistakable Eastern European ancestry, Slavic touches, genetic threads from lands far beyond the Danube. They'd lived together, prayed together, died together, but they were not the same. One tribe likely came westward, from Italian ports and Mediterranean coasts. The other northward, through Bohemia, Silesia, maybe fleeing older fires. They arrived with different accents, different customs, different ghosts. And yet, in Erfurt, they converged. Traders and scribes, widows and merchants, outsiders inside the same walled quarter, survivors of pogroms and wars, migrants from crumbling towns, their lineages braided by shared fear and unexpected hope. It wasn't just a cemetery. It was a genetic junction. Because what happened next wasn't extinction. It was fusion. The two groups, so different, began to merge. Their children carried both lineages. Their marriages rewrote ancestry. And from that graveyard came a new genome, a new people. Not fully Middle Eastern, not fully European, but something else. A hybrid forged in blood, faith, and fire. And that fusion, that genetic collision, didn't stop in Erfurt. Because it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the crucible. And what came after would echo through every Ashkenazi genome on Earth. In every Ashkenazi genome, there's a shadow, a whisper from the past, hidden in the strands, not just of ancestry, but of survival. For decades, scientists believed the genetic bottleneck came late, a slow constriction, a long narrowing through exile and war. But they were wrong. The truth was buried under a granary in Erfurt and at the bottom of a well in Norwich. When they tested the remains, they didn't just find kinship, they found collapse. A single moment in time. Sharp, violent, final. Not a trickle, a plunge. Fewer than 1,000. Perhaps only 300. The number of Ashkenazi Jews who made it through the genetic bottleneck, alive, fertile, surviving, and from whom millions now descend. It's hard to grasp that the genetic future of an entire people came down to a few hundred names, most now lost. That whole lineages, whole languages were reduced to silence. But in that silence, something strange happened. Patterns began to repeat. Specific gene sequences, rare mutations, diseases once scattered across continents, now clustered in one group. Tay-Sachs, BRCA, Gaucher, disorders that linger like ghosts, not because of curse or fate, but because of math. In a small population, every gene shouts louder. The Erfurt data showed it clearly. Even in the 1300s, some individuals already carried mutations found in modern Ashkenazi families. It wasn't just passed down. It was locked in. And this is where history and biology blur. Because the trauma of the medieval world, the pogroms, the plague, the forced conversions, didn't just leave stories. It left scars inside the genome. Heritable, invisible, unshakable. So how does a people rebuild from that? How do you go from a handful of survivors to 10 million? How does a lineage become that strong, that unified, that distinct? And yet, still carry DNA that looks like a mosaic. Because this bottleneck, this isolation, should have made them homogeneous. But the Ashkenazi genome defies logic. It's not just a mirror of survival. It's a paradox. So the question is, how could so much diversity survive in so small a cage? It shouldn't fit together. Half from the deserts, half from the olive groves of Rome, the hills of Greece, the snow-lined forests of Poland. And yet it does. The Ashkenazi genome isn't a line. It's a window. A stained glass window, shattered, scattered, then somehow fused into something luminous. Autosomal DNA reveals it plainly, a near-perfect blend. 50% Middle Eastern, 50% European. But not just any European. Italian warmth, Greek elegance, Slavic steel. Genomes shaped by roads walked in exile, in migration, in marriage, in silence. You can see it not just in the lab, but in the kitchens, in the words, in the graves. Yiddish, born from German grammar, raised with Hebrew soul, spiced with Slavic rhythm. A language stitched like tapestry, multilingual, multicultural, unmistakably Jewish. Burial stones in medieval Europe carved in Hebrew, but shaded by local superstition. Ashkenazi recipes, gefilte fish, borscht, cholent, dishes that carry the DNA of multiple nations. One pot, many histories. This isn't assimilation. It's synthesis. The genes tell the same story. Long strands of shared segments, some ancient, some shockingly recent, passed down through centuries of pressure, of endogamy, of relentless outside force, and relentless internal resilience. And still the genome doesn't collapse into sameness. It fragments. But instead of breaking, it refracts. A prism of history, catching light from both east and west. Because the Ashkenazi identity was never a pure line. It was always a mosaic. An identity forged not in isolation, but in tension, in contradiction, in the meeting of tribes that shouldn't have met, but did. And what came out was something no empire could plan, no synagogue could script. A people who looked like paradox, but moved like destiny. But here's where the story turns again. Because when scientists stared into that mosaic, when they pulled apart each fragment, searching for the edges, they didn't just see Europe or the Levant. They saw something older, buried deeper, something that didn't match either world, but still lived inside them. They weren't supposed to be this close. And yet, when scientists compared the genomes, the result hit like a drumbeat from the past. Modern Italians, the closest European relatives to Ashkenazi Jews, closer than Slavs, closer than Germans, closer than Greeks. The DNA didn't lie. It told of bonds not forged in shtetls, but in marble cities, in the shadows of Roman arches, in catacombs and candlelight. Long before Krakow and Kiev, there were Jews in Rome. Not tourists, not traders, residents, converts, captives, generations who stayed and mingled. Some arrived in chains, marched from Jerusalem after the temple fell. Others came by choice, through marriage or migration. By the time of the Caesars, synagogues stood beside temples, Torah scrolls in Latin homes, Jewish gravestones written in Greek, chipped, sun-bleached, still legible. And the genes? They remembered. Ashkenazi DNA carries Southern European signatures, especially Italian. Clusters that trace not to later converts, but to those early centuries, when Jewishness was a thing you could join, when faith crossed bloodlines, when lines blurred. In underground ruins, archaeologists found mosaic floors, menorahs nestled next to Roman patterns. Names like Faustina, Agrippa, Tullia, Jewish names, but Roman too. That blur wasn't a betrayal. It was a beginning. But those beginnings were buried. When ghettos rose and walls locked in identity, that Italian thread was forgotten, erased, like a whisper behind a curtain, too distant to hear, too familiar to name. Until now. Now the genome has reopened the file, and it speaks not of assimilation, but of ancestry, of mothers who lit Sabbath lamps on Roman hearths, of fathers who wrote contracts in Latin and buried their dead with Hebrew prayers. They were not strangers. They were the missing chapter. But if Ashkenazim are this tied to Italy, to Rome, to conversion, to survival, to roots in the West, then where is the East? Where is the Levant? Where is the homeland they prayed toward, but left behind? A strand of DNA, just one, can stretch across empires. It starts in the Levant, Bronze Age hills, date palms, dust. A father teaches his son to recite the Shema. Then exile. That same strand crosses the Mediterranean, slips through Alexandria, weaves through Rome, hides in the back alleys of Toledo, and later through Krakow, Prague, Erfurt, still intact. That Y-DNA line, the male signature, doesn't vanish. It doesn't scatter. It threads through time, unchanged in its core, echoing in Mizrahi voices in Baghdad, Sephardi laments in Andalusia, Ashkenazi prayers in Poland. Thousands of years apart, but the same spark. Science mapped it. Not poetry, not prayer, hard data. And what it found shattered every border. Mizrahi, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, 3 names, 1 origin, different melodies, same soul. It's not just a family tree. It's a memory buried in blood, passed down like a blessing or a bruise. From Levite to Levite, tribe to tribe, from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, from the ruins of Erfurt to a bar mitzvah in Brooklyn. Same father, same strand. But this is where the truth bends, because if Jewishness is written into the genome, it's also not confined to it. The blood speaks, yes, but the story, it lives beyond cells. Identity here isn't race. It isn't skin. It's ritual. It's rhythm. It's resilience. What does it mean to belong when your genes cross every empire that tried to erase you? What does it mean to carry the Middle East in your blood and Europe in your accent? To sing in German Hebrew? To cook Roman Jewish dishes? To bury your dead in Polish soil, facing Zion? Maybe the borders were always illusions. Maybe belonging was never about lines on a map. But if identity isn't just blood, and it isn't just belief, then what is it? DNA can tell you where your story began, but it can't tell you how it felt. It can trace migrations, reveal bottlenecks, name forgotten grandmothers, but it can't describe the silence of a Sabbath candle, flickering behind a wooden door in Krakow, or the sound of a lullaby, sung in a dialect long extinct. It can't measure what it cost to stay Jewish when the world said not to be, because genes don't remember hiding in cellars, or carving Hebrew into tombstones no one was allowed to visit, or whispering prayers that risked your life, that live somewhere else, somewhere deeper. The genome gives us the map, but the memory, the ache, the resilience, the refusal to vanish, that's carved into something DNA can't read. Yet still the echoes remain. The 4 mothers, converted, forgotten, European and invisible, live on in millions, not just in mitochondria, but in recipes, in customs, in silence. The 350 survivors, the ones who passed through the bottleneck, who rebuilt from ashes, shaped not just the genome, but the emotional blueprint of a people who have always existed at the edge. And those 2 tribes of Erfurt, buried side by side, genetically distant, spiritually united, they still speak. In you, in all of us. Ashkenazi identity was never a single thread. It's a tapestry, woven in trauma, stitched with prayer, dyed with memory. And maybe that's the truth. Maybe your ancestors weren't who you were taught. Maybe they weren't Levites or scholars or martyrs. Maybe they were strangers, converts, survivors, wanderers, women no one named, men with no homeland, people who didn't match the myths, but still, somehow became you. So what happens when your past isn't a place, but a pattern? What if your ancestors were not who you thought, but everything you are? In the next episode, we cross the sea, into cathedrals and kitchens of medieval Spain, where a different Jewish story was unfolding, and its bones are still whispering,